Hello everyone, my name is Colvin Harry. I am from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm one of the fellows for 2024 for Climate Tracker. And today I want to talk a bit about my experience and the experience on a whole of Vincentians on the passage of major Hurricane Beryl that passed through the islands on July 1st. That was an experience. You know, there's a saying, June too soon, July standby, August come they must, September remember. But that's not the experience for us this year. On July 1st, we were hit by a Category 4 hurricane, possibly stronger, winds exceeding 130 miles per hour that devastated the southern Grenadine Islands. And I was in the center of all of that. And when I say that in terms of my media obligations, as I work at the National Broadcasting Corporation, and we were tasked with staying on air and providing critical information during the passage of the system. Now, on the few days before, we heard the meteorologists talk about the system that is going to approach us, but to us it seemed unreal. A Category 3 system being forecast to hit St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The last time that happened was in 1898, over 120 years ago. So it's not that people weren't taking it seriously, they were just caught a little surprise. A system this strong in June, first day of July, and it's coming towards us. But as the days moved on, we realized how serious it was. All the forecasts began to materialize. At one point, the Prime Minister had to take to the airwaves to say, well, this is it. This is what the forecast is saying. And from there, it all went downhill. On the Sunday evening, we realized how serious it was. That was on June, the last day of June. And that was when we really knew that we were going to be hit by a major hurricane. Where exactly? We didn't quite know. Somewhere between southern Grenadines and possibly mainland was going to get hit. But it so happens that the southern Grenadines took the brunt of it. The eye passed over Carriacou, which belongs to Grenada just south of us, and the northeast quadrant, the very strong areas, passed over Union Island and Myro and those islands, and they were utterly devastated. Now, during the passage of the system, I remember that we were on air at one point. You know, we had a team working there, we had a technical person there, but it got really scary at about mid-morning on July 1st, and this is when the core of the system was passing by, and we could hear things blowing around. We could, as we looked out the window when it was safe enough to do so, we realized that this was really destructive that was happening, and we were worried that others who didn't have a secure structure was going to be hit very hard by it. Our neighbors across the road took a beating. A residential home for the elderly that's just pretty much feet away. We saw the roof was about to lift off, and that was how close it was home for us. Our satellite receiver in the back of the station was just, swaying in the wind. At any moment, we expected it to go flying. There were galvanized sheets flying in the distance. It was pure madness. And the experience of what was happening only came to light in the days following the passage of the system. And it was heartbreaking what we saw in the Grenadines. I mean, when we heard the calls of those who were experiencing the winds, we saw the comments that the winds were really picking up in some areas. We knew that we were in trouble. And at that critical point, we realized that we were going to need a lot of help. At the end of it, Myro and Union Island sustained between 95 and 98% destruction. Pretty much near 100% of the buildings there were either significantly damaged or destroyed. Picking up pieces continues to be a major challenge, and the work continues. It's not going to take 2 days, it's not going to take 2 months, it's not going to take 2 years. It's going to take a very long time for us to get to the point of a full recovery here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I hope our discussion today can shed some light on the experience that I had, the experience that my colleagues had, and what we saw after this unprecedented major Hurricane Beryl passed. Stay tuned.
Welcome to another episode of Caribbean Climate Calabash, the podcast that brings to you stories of resilience, stories of innovation, and pressing issues of climate change across the beautiful region. My name is Dizzanne Billy, and I'm the Caribbean Regional Director at Climate Tracker. And today we're diving into the impact of Hurricane Beryl and what it reveals for climate change in the Caribbean. I'm joined by Colvin Harry, a broadcast journalist from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who was on the ground reporting as the catastrophic hurricane unfolded. So in this episode, we'll explore his experiences, the challenges of covering such an event, and what we can learn about the role of media in helping communities to prepare for climate disasters. So let's get into this important discussion. Welcome to Caribbean Climate Calabash. Colvin, thanks for joining us. Please start off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Dizzanne, and thanks again to Climate Tracker for this opportunity to tell the climate stories of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Well, where do I start? I'm from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I believe folks know that from the introduction. And I grew up in the rural areas, a farming community. I was surrounded by farms where I grew up and had a very quiet upbringing. Both parents were farmers, so I had quite a lot of exposure to agriculture, and that's what schooled me, primary and secondary. I attended the South Rivers Methodist School, which was not too far from where I resided at the time, and then all the way to Kingstown, which was in the city, for my secondary education, and that's where I developed a love for weather. I've always been interested in weather. And at some point in the latter years of my secondary education, I also developed a liking for broadcast radio. Not so much television. Yes, I like to watch television, but radio was where I had an interest. And the opportunity came up for me to, to join a small private radio station at the time that had very little coverage. But I saw that as the option. At the age of 17, I joined what was then called Total FM. It was a easy listening station. Imagine a 17-year-old working at an easy listening station. It wasn't necessarily my style at the time, as we say, but it grew on me. And since then, I've never left radio. This is now 17 years for me, going on to 18 years in radio for me. And all those years, I've had quite a journey, starting as an announcer. And I progressed to doing radio production, editing audio. And I then moved to the National Broadcasting Corporation, and where I'm currently at in 2008. Then again, the journey began there as an announcer, followed by the IT technician, the program director, program manager, and I'm currently the assistant general manager at the national station, NBC Radio. So that's the journey for me in a nutshell.
That's amazing, Colvin. So tell me, I would love to know who, since this is, you're interested in music and in radio, I would love to know, who is your favorite artist right now?
Well, I've developed a love for the 80s music, and I think that stemmed from my introduction to radio. That is all the station played, really. So I still have a connection with some of the earlier pop sensations from the 80s and the 90s. We think about the Madonnas and the good old Michael Jackson. You can't get enough of Michael Jackson. I don't necessarily follow a lot of the new music, though I do like Afrobeat, I must say. I do follow some of the soca, but of course, being that I came again from an easy listening background, I tend to prefer what you term in Trinidad and Tobago as the groovy soca. That's what you call it, right? Yes, we call it raga soca in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Same thing, just a different name, really. But the ones that are, more lyrically structured. So, and Calypso, of course, spanning the entire region. I've always loved to hear the likes of Sugar Aloes and Kitchen, a Lord Kitchen, and all of these guys and Sparrow. I mean, can't forget Sparrow in the mix of things. But yes, I don't know if I can give you a specific favorite. I like pretty much all kinds of music. And if it appeals to me, I listen.
Yes, I get you. I'm glad to know that groovy soca is popular across there. Yes. We also, there was a point in time where we used to have we have the Soca Monarch. We haven't for a couple years, I think, had the groovy Soca Monarch. but hopefully it will make another comeback in the next carnival season. So I'll jump straight into it, Colvin. I would love to know, what it was like for you covering Hurricane Beryl in real time, because for me in Trinidad, we were following the intensity of how the hurricane was forming and gaining speed so quickly. It was so different for us here, So you there as it was approaching St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I would love to know what it was like for you covering it in real time, and can you walk us through some of your experiences as the storm approached and made landfall?
Well, what a journey that was. Well, I'll backtrack to say that this is one of several tropical storm, hurricane, approaching weather system coverage that I've done. I've been doing this since the year 2010. Because I'm interested in weather, to an extent, it brings me a level of excitement, but at the same time, there is a fear factor. What happens when this system eventually reaches to us? I covered Hurricane Thomas. I'm not sure if you remember that in 2010, and subsequently there have been several tropical storms that came very close, but nothing like major Hurricane Beryl. And I like to qualify Beryl by saying that it was a major Hurricane Beryl, because that's the reality of it. It was no ordinary hurricane that approached and hit St. Vincent and the Grenadines and then Carriacou, the Grenadines, and St. Vincent. It wasn't just your ordinary hurricane. I think it started when we saw the early forecast guidance, and that was from the National Hurricane Center. The cone of uncertainty, it started to show that we were going to get something. How strong, we didn't know. The initial forecast track was through Carriacou and Grenada. Then it shifted north, and then it shifted south again, and then it sort of stayed through the Grenadines. About 3 days before it actually arrived, we realized that it was really picking up steam, as I say. It was really getting stronger. By that time, it was already a hurricane, and it was expected to be a Category 2 by the time it got to us. What eventually happened, it became a Category 3. But the track at that time had it going through about the central to northern Grenadine Islands. You'd say Beckwith. Beckwith's part of the northern Grenadines, and that would have put it very, very close to Kingstown, with winds about 125 miles per hour, 120 miles per hour, or close to that, 115 to 120 miles per hour. And that is when it became clear that the forecast models were as accurate as you can get them. It's going to hit the Grenadines or St. Vincent. We can't avoid it. This is just what we have to face. Initially, the response we get as Caribbean people, you hear folks say, "Oh, it's not going to come here. God is of intention." You would hear that along the Caribbean islands, because I was told it's the same thing that is being said. God is a Bajan, God is a St. Lucian, and I'm sure when things are happening in Trinidad, you may hear that from time to time. Well, God is a Trini. But it was unescapable in our case. It approached us, it started to affect us, I believe, on the Saturday evening, where we got the outer bands in terms of some showers. But that is when we really ramped up our coverage in terms of local coverage. We were actually doing some repairs at the station, so it meant that things were not necessarily business as usual for us. We were not operating in our studio. We were operating in an office space, actually. And I'm not sure if you were able to see the video, because we were streaming live as we provided coverage. We were actually in a little space, in a tiny space, trying to keep the communication going. But on this Saturday night, which was, trying to remember the timeline here, it arrived on the Monday, but the Saturday was the 29th. Yes, the 29th of June. And that is when the Prime Minister came on the airwaves, and it really became a matter of this is going to be, because he shared what the officials were saying, what the weather professionals were saying, that this is not just a hurricane, but a major hurricane that will be affecting us in a matter of less than 48 hours. And I think that is when most Vincentians really realize, hey, this is coming our way. And this is not your regular tropical storm, a couple of trees broken, a pole maybe down. But this was going to be serious. Where exactly it was going to hit us, we were still hoping that it would take that track north and go away from the islands, but it didn't. On the Sunday, again, the Prime Minister came back to our studios because we became sort of command central for information, as it usually is, and all the other platforms would broadcast, take our feed and relay otherwise. And the Sunday, when he did his last address, that was a Sunday evening, he said point blank, house roofs are going to be blown off. We are going to lose property. We are going to lose possessions. If you haven't secured it, I'm sorry, but you may just lose it. He just pretty much made it clear, you know. And I think when it really hit home was when he said, I don't even think my residence is safe to withstand 120 miles per wind. I am putting things in place to move. And for those who are familiar with where the Prime Minister's residence is located, yes, it's at the top of a hill, but it's a well-constructed building. So imagine if you're hearing the Prime Minister saying that he may have to move, he's waiting on, advice to move, that this was going to be bad. It's going to be bad for us. I mean, by then, the idea was that the storm or the hurricane would come very close to Kingstown on the track. As it turns out, late on Sunday, early into Monday morning, it continued west instead of just slight north of due west, was forecast. So it headed straight for Union Island, Myro, Caraco. Those islands were in the direct path of the hurricane. That's Caraco and Grenada. And I actually passed over Union Island. But I think when we really started to see the weather going downhill was early on Monday morning. We had cameras on the outside, of course, getting footage and getting those who were able to send us pictures and videos as to what was happening in their area. And it got really bad in Kingstown at about 10 o'clock, and that's where the outer bands began to sweep in. And I remember looking through the window, and we have a satellite dish on the back of one of the buildings.
Right.
Receives the BBC World Service, and it was literally just doing this. It was just shaking.
Wow.
Any moment, because I was telling my technicians, that's when we took a break in the broadcast. I don't think this dish is going to be here in another hour if it continues to be like that. Because it's been there since the 1980s. We didn't know if it would survive. And then the wind picked up. It was really strong. We started to hear, pieces of aluminum, galvanized pieces just blowing around on the outside. We looked outside and we saw in the distance some houses that already had rose in the distance. And our transmission tower, which was also visible from our location, was also not looking too great. Obviously, the wind was really putting some pressure on it. And we really didn't know if we'd remain on air for the next hour, because that is when the core of the system began to come in. And as we were live, we saw some messages from the Grenadines saying, it's getting really bad here. And then we stopped getting messages. So just before midday is when it got really bad in the Grenadines, from what we're told. All communication was lost there. And we began to be concerned that we may not have gotten the worst of it, that the Grenadines did. And that was indeed the case. We saw folks asking, what about the Grenadines? We haven't heard from them. And while that was happening, there were countless calls coming in, messages coming in that houses were being blown off around Kingstown, particularly on the as you know, we're a mountainous area, a mountainous country. So a lot of the homes are built, to get a view of the ocean, but that works to your disadvantage in a way, because that also exposes you to losing your roof. And that's what happened in many cases. Then we got a report that the botanical gardens, the oldest in the Western Hemisphere, that took a major blow. Trees that were standing there for almost 100 years, or way more than 100 years in one case, they were underground. That's when we knew this was no ordinary hurricane wind. It was that serious. By that time, there was no communication with the Grenadines. We really were not looking forward to hearing what happened to the Grenadines, because that is when we knew things were definitely going south. The power failed shortly after, but fortunately, we were able to remain on the air. We broke transmission for about a minute, and we got a little worried that was it. Nobody's going to hear us from now. But it came back on because our generator kicked in. It couldn't go outside to trigger the generator, but by some divine intervention, it started. And we were able to continue the broadcast. We only went off air, I believe, in the Grenadines because the transmission was interrupted on the island of Becker, which served the southern Grenadines. But we were able to remain on air throughout the major hurricane and servicing at least 80% of the country, from what I'm told. And that is when we there was some sense of hope that because we were worried that we would lose the transmission altogether. We lost the internet, so our internet listeners eventually disappeared. So to our live stream online, but we continued on radio. But there was a point where it got really scary because where we were in that room, it had windows. And if you're hearing things hitting against the building, doors opening and closing, nearby, that it's really bad. And then someone looked out of the window and saw an elderly home that's right across from our studios. The roof started to do like this, literally dancing. And the galvanized sheeting started to peel away. The fence came tumbling down, so we knew this was no longer safe. So we had to abruptly end the broadcast there out of for our own safety, because we didn't know any of those pieces of galvanized sheetings would come shooting through the window. So we decided to not look through the window and just, let our listeners know that our space, is not safe at the moment, and we'll continue for as long as it's possible to bring more information to them. Well, it so happens that is exactly the moment where we lost we had two connections. We lost the first connection earlier, and then we lost the secondary connection that handled the video feed. We switched over to a temporary one. So we were then completely cut off in terms of the online audience. So I believe that's when people really start to get worried that we were okay, because the last thing they heard from us is that we were moving from that space that we were because of the safety issue. And I mean, that was we pretty much were in a much better position than many of our counterparts who had it really terrible in the Grenadines. And the aftermath and what we saw, pictures that eventually we only saw several days later, because there was absolutely no way to get a message out of the towers or ripped apart. All of the broadcast repeaters, the cell sites were destroyed. The parts were nowhere to be found. Not even the structures were remaining, because they got the strongest of the winds. And in that particular piece that I wrote, I spoke to two of those who experienced it firsthand. one on Union Island. And they explained that they saw literally tornado-like features just lifting house roofs off and just spinning it, and then it's disappearing into the distance. And that was a similar scene in Myra as well. That is the same thing that happened. Literally entire house roofs just lifted off and disappeared. Windows ripped out, everything sucked out like a vacuum. And I mean, it was scary to even hear that. We, on the mainland, while we had a lot of structural damage and infrastructural damage, the intensity of it was nowhere to what those who lived on Canoan, Myro, and Union Island, especially Union Island and Myro, experienced on that day, on Monday. That was the 1st of July. It was absolutely crazy. Not sure if there's anything else you want me to add to that.
Colvin, there's a lot to unpack there, you know what I mean? And one of the things that you mentioned there is how, the Caribbean people, we tend to be a very unserious people, right? As the young people say, unserious people. In that, God is a Trini, and God is a Vincentian, and God is a Jamaican. And especially here in Trinidad and Tobago, we say it all the time, God is a Trini. And, people tend to take it, people tend to take it very, very lightly when hurricanes are coming and they issue a storm warning and so on. But what we're seeing here is that, the hurricanes are forming faster. They're forming further out, and they're gaining speed quicker, and they're actually forming in a more southerly direction, which kind of puts Trinidad and Tobago in a direct, line of fire.
Risk.
Exactly. So, and then the other thing is that, 2 drops of rain fall here and we have a flood.
Yeah.
So, we do definitely not ready. So I just want to hear from you, like, how is it, you having covered these sort of stories before, what is it like trying to prepare for something that you feel like is almost not possible to prepare for, to cover?
Well, on a personal basis, or in terms of information wise for the broader audience, from which angle?
Both. I would love to hear from both.
Okay, from the personal end, we try to internally put all our systems in place. Literally a week before, our technical team and the director of our technical department also follows the weather quite closely, fortunately. So he took steps a week in advance in fueling up all our generator systems, checking, tightening all our antennas and all our repeaters, and we have 7 of those. So that was a process that took several days. But he had the foresight that, look, this thing could very well hit us very hard. So what we had to do was make sure that all our systems were ready for what possibly could be hitting us. And it turns out that it was the best thing that he did, because in the one unavoidable case where we went off, we were able to remain on, and none of our antennas left their towers, or none of our transmitters were blown out, or power went down completely, because they all had backup generators filled to the brim, basically, with diesel, to make sure that we could remain on. And that is one of the ways we internally did that preparing. We also had internally supplies, to make sure that the team was well taken care of, that we were comfortable. The members of the team, they were asked to take some time and prepare their homes, store water like we did here as well, just in case. Supplies, we had PSAs running that, apply to us as well as did to the public. Your canned goods, store water, charge all your battery operated devices. People don't say transistor radios anymore, but if you do still have a transistor radio, get batteries for your transistor. But likewise, charge all of your devices to stay connected. And while we reinforce that, we too practice that in preparing. But as you know, there's no perfect way to prepare, because as much as you do, there's still the possibility of damage that is beyond your control. Protecting your documents, putting them in plastic bags, etc., which I think quite a few persons have been doing. Well, it's a lesson out of this hurricane. While we did not get a whole lot of rain, the wind was certainly terrible. And had we got the rain in addition to the wind, I fear that it may have been further, far worse than what it.
Yeah.
So it was almost like a dry hurricane, for want of a better expression. Yes, we had rain, but it wasn't the amounts, 6 to 8 inches, that was being forecast. We didn't escape the winds, however. But the preparations pretty much took different dimensions. We appealed to those who were listening to, of course, make sure that their household was ready. If you have five family members living with you, to make sure you have enough water for those 5 to last at least 3 days, 3 to 5 days in some cases. And the preparation was pretty much as best as we could advise, given the circumstances. There are those who followed and were able to say after that, I'm glad that I listened. And there were those who said after, well, I wish I had listened and took your advice, because they lost their homes, they lost their possessions, they lost important documents. And if they'd only taken the steps, they may have been in a better position in terms of their documents, etc., when they had to run after their structures are compromised.
Yeah. So for the benefit of our listeners, there are certain records that Hurricane Beryl kind of blew through, for lack of a better phrase, right? It was the furthest east hurricane that had ever formed in June. It was the first ever Category 4 hurricane on record in June. It was the earliest Category 4 hurricane on record for the Atlantic. It was the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record for the Atlantic, beating back the previous record held by Hurricane Emily in 2005 by 2 weeks. It was the strongest hurricane crossing the Windward Islands. And for those of our listeners who are not familiar with Caribbean geography and what the Windward Islands are, I suggest that you Google that. We're very special. We like to talk about the Windward Islands and the Leeward Islands and so on. And it was also the fastest rapid intensification of any hurricane before September the 1st. I mean, breaking through so many different records. I would love to know from you, Colvin, what is it like to, or what are some of the challenges, right, that's faced by media in the Caribbean in reporting on storms like this in terms of gathering information, keeping on top of it with regards to the correct information that you're sharing, all while worried about the safety of yourself and your family, you know? What is it like in that sense? And also, what support do you think media needs? Because we expect that this will become the new norm.
Well, frankly, we were the only entity in terms of broadcast entity that dedicated time to coverage and continuous coverage. It is generally not something that is done by local media, and I'm suspecting it's quite similar regionally because you incur costs. And in our case, we did not have sponsors. And I think that was one of the areas that we said maybe in the future, because there are cost implications. You have to have staff that stay beyond their usual hours. You have to bring out reinforcement. You have to prepare with your food and etc. to make sure that your staff is as well as they're safe, that they're fed as well. In our case, I think it's a little different because as part of our, we see it as part of our obligation. So it's not a case where we are paid to do this. And I'm glad I had the opportunity to say this because it's part of our service to the country as a national broadcaster. You may not find a private radio station or private television station do this because, again, the cost implication. Yes, they provide a service to their listeners. However, they too have to also, look at the cost that is involved. Additionally, we have backup systems in place, and because of the purpose that we exist for, many of our private media do not have that such. So what tends to happen is they shut everything down. They power down their transmitters, they turn off all of the equipment because they feared lightning damaging their equipment, and of course damage to their towers, etc. Setting them back. So they tend to shut things down in some cases to protect their investments. So I think more needs to be done from the corporate end to recognize those entities who are sparing the resources or putting the resources into motion to remain on air and to provide coverage. I know in some other territories, the coverage of an approaching hurricane has a significant commercial value. I remember looking at CBC just across in Barbados, and they have commercial sponsors. Whenever they have running storm coverage brought to you by. It's not something that has gotten the attention of corporate world, at least not here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm not sure with the other islands and in Trinidad, but it has gotten the attention of those in Barbados, and they see the value of it. So I think more needs to be done from the corporate end to realize that this is just the start of it. There are going to be, down the road, many other opportunities for you to get your message across. And it's an opportunity where almost the entire country will be glued to their radio and their television. And it's a brilliant way to get your message across. And at the same time, making sure that these entities can deliver the best that they can. They can bring out the best to anchor their broadcasts. They can bring in experts who will be able to shed light and explain and break things down and provide an uninterrupted service, basically, to the best of their ability. So I think corporate support is one. Also, the support from the state, and I can tell you that we've gotten that here because the Prime Minister tends to come straight to our broadcast location whenever there's an approaching system. And likewise, we have the folks at NEMO, which is our national emergency agency, a direct line into there as well. Sometimes we do have someone who's physically there from one of our partner media, the television arm, the Agency for Public Information, the director who feeds information to us. He or she is physically in that space of the national emergency, NEMO's office. So we are fortunate enough to have that support and to be able to get information. Likewise, they can tell us the reports that are coming in regarding, damaged properties, etc. And we too will be providing that as they come into us from the callers, from those who are providing the feedback in the communities. And they on the other end are listening to hear what they need to respond to. So one, corporate, and two, maybe a bit more in terms of the support from various agencies that you assist in the process of providing that information for.
And having been a part of the climate justice program that we run at Climate Tracker, Colvin, I'd love for you to share with our listeners as well. What are some key lessons that you think local journalists and the media have learned or need to learn from or about covering events like Hurricane Beryl when it comes to future hurricane seasons?
All right. I think what needs to be clear is that we have to recognize that now more than ever, we're at a higher risk of getting impacted, especially by a tropical system. And our media outlets have to be able to be nimble, to have resources on standby, to be able to do more in terms of climate-related issues. Unfortunately, we don't see, and I think I said this on a previous session, we don't see a whole lot of climate-related reporting here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Yes, we report on it whenever the Prime Minister says something, or whenever there's a new report saying that it is, we're past the 1.5% or some spicy, subject related to the issue of climate change. But on a day-to-day, month-to-month, week-to-week basis, we hardly ever hear about climate-related issues. And this is what needs to change. This is what those in the media here, and I believe across the region, need to understand, is that we now have to live with the effects of climate change. It's not a if or when, but it's now. And the significant amount that is being invested by our governments collectively, which is also another one of the pieces I worked on for my TikTok video, it's expensive. The climate change mitigation and adaptation costs a lot of money. Sea defense, river defense, all of these things that we tend to have to put in place to protect our property, to protect livelihoods. More needs to be done by our reporters, our journalists, whether broadcast, whether electronic, print, to be able to highlight these issues. And I think one of the lessons learned from especially this recent occurrence is that our media, unfortunately, may not be as familiar as they need to be with climate-related issues, at least not enough so to report on it or to bring the information or the issues to the forefront. So more training would definitely benefit the broader media, I believe, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, exposing more of our practitioners to climate-related coverage and how to report on it, as what Climate Tracker does. And if that opportunity is given, I believe we'll see more and more of our journalists taking up and seeing the importance of highlighting these issues on an ongoing basis, not just when something spicy comes out or when a head of state or somebody who's important says something about it.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because I think that's something that is, it's applicable across the region in terms of media actually getting the chance to focus on climate reporting. And it's a little bit strange as well, because we are such a vulnerable region. We're one of the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable regions in the world, yet the media is not where it should be. And I think that that's where, what we do at Climate Tracker comes into play. And I hope that, yourself and all the other journalists that we've been so fortunate to work with over the past few years, I hope that you continue, in this train that you've already started with telling these climate stories. And I think that kind of leads me into another interesting point that I'd love to hear from you in terms of the representation of the Caribbean out there. First of all, it's not really much, right? In terms of what they actually, in the international media sphere, what they actually report. I remember when the Hurricane Beryl was going on, like the news would be going, like I was watching, I won't call any names, but I was watching this particular channel and the news was going on and then they're like, Hurricane Beryl for 2 seconds, and then they continue, and it's just like little blips here and there, and it's, can't pronounce the word Grenada, these kind of things. And so I'd love to know from you, Colvin, do you think that international media accurately represents the unique challenges that the Caribbean faces and small island developing states face with regards to climate change and hurricanes?
No, I think that it is grossly underreported, as a matter of fact. Yes, there are a million things happening, in the Middle East and around the world that has the attention of the world. But at the same time, we are just as important. There's, 100 and something thousand people living on an island. We're just as important as the 4.5 million people who are affected in another region of the world, because we too have a very large diaspora in the global landscape. We have Caribbean people from, as you say, the Jamaicans will say, if you go to Antarctica, you'll find a Jamaican there. And it's a Caribbean thing. You'll find Trinidadians, you'll find Vincentians, you'll find St. Lucians everywhere, China, Japan, Australia. And they need to know what's happening home. So I think the international media, when it comes to hurricanes in particular, we don't really hear from them. If there's an earthquake, we may get a little bit more attention in the media. And the volcano, for instance, that may not necessarily be climate change related, but because of what it was, I mean, we got quite a lot of international coverage, I'll say, from the eruption. I actually did I did 3 live reports for Al Jazeera, live on Al Jazeera English, which I believe is probably the highlight of my career thus far, because of the audience of Al Jazeera English. But outside of that, and the coverage we got for the volcano, we don't get that when it comes to a hurricane. And I think what happened with the volcano too, because it had effects on other nearby islands as well, this was impacted. St. Lucia with the ash fall, and then it became the issue. Well, if we look at it, it's also a climate change related issue, because the gases and what escaped from the volcano made its way up into the upper atmosphere and disrupted the natural flow of things up there. So it is indeed a climate change related issue. But I think that greater emphasis needs to be placed on things such as when we have an approaching storm, an approaching hurricane, in highlighting the potential impacts for very small economies like ours. The fact that we were hit by Hurricane Beryl with winds in excess of 130 miles per hour, and from the eyewitness accounts that we got from the Grenadines, probably it was more than 130 miles per hour, who knows? Because it was really gaining strength when it approached Union Island, Myra, and those islands. And the fact that we pretty much get 3 seconds of the news, there's a hurricane, and then you mentioned they wasn't able to even pronounce Grenada correctly, and they might say Granada or something to that effect.
That's exactly it.
You might Trinidad and Tobago,
Yeah, exactly.
And you like, no, they don't know much about our territory.
No.
And I believe if the international media sees the possibilities of them getting even greater audience, not just in the region, but around the world, from Caribbean people and for people who really want to know what's happening in countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Trinidad and Tobago and the other islands of the region. If they have correspondents in the region, that would help. But many of them, they don't. In the case of Al Jazeera, they did not have somebody in the region. So that was pretty much a focal point for the volcano. And a couple other local media persons checked in along the way as well with them. The BBC, for example, they sent someone, but he's based in Mexico. So he covers Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean. But until he got here, you had to get on-the-ground reports and all of that. And when there's a storm or hurricane, you may not necessarily get that extensive in terms of coverage. You may say that it's now a Category 2, it's approaching the Eastern Caribbean, full stop. There's nothing else. There's no detail. So I think the committing of resources, more resources to the Caribbean region, not just Latin America, because Latin America is a huge space by itself, but separating the Caribbean, using the Caribbean as its own region, Latin America by itself, and have someone who know about the geography, who know what happens on the small islands and the potential for the economy and for people's lives and livelihoods. So definitely more resources in terms of reporters and boots on the ground, or even local experts that you can tap into, not necessarily flying in a reporter from the US or from the UK, but having building capacity, training journalists in the region to report for the event that you have such an occurrence.
Yeah, and I feel as though, something that has been bothering me for a while is the way that, and you touched on it a bit, the way that the Caribbean gets, consumed into this overarching umbrella called Latin America and the Caribbean, and how problematic that is. If you want to find out the Caribbean story, talk to Caribbean people.
Correct.
talk to the Caribbean people who are on the ground and know exactly the history of what has happened and where we are right now and what we are experiencing, you know, and I think that's a message that I would love to put out there for all international media to hear. And also for you to tell me, I mean, what is next for you? Because I know that you've been telling a lot of interesting stories as part of our Climate Justice Fellowship. You've, one of my favorites was about the water shortage
Yes.
in Vincent and the Grenadines, you know, and you've told a story about Hurricane Beryl, and all of your stories have been very informative. I would love to know for you, Colvin, what's next for Colvin Harry?
Well, I think what's next for me is, now that I've learned quite a lot from this, and of course the training that I've been given the opportunity to benefit from. I don't think this is not something you go to university to learn. It's directly from the experts, and I think the training played a big part that was given by Climate Tracker and guiding the way that I structured those stories and I reported on those issues. And I think I'm now better equipped to, outside of Climate Tracker, when I'm finished at the end of this, I can, on a local level, contribute to the narrative, to be able to report locally in a more detailed way, in a more, should I say, a professional and a guided way, because I know I'm now equipped to know what you shouldn't do, how you should approach the story, some of the people you should speak to when it comes to certain issues. And I think the opportunity at Climate Tracker was one of those that gave me some additional tools that I can use, not just in my current job, but in speaking more about climate-related issues in the local media. And I think I mentioned this to you in the earlier part. I'm not a big writer because I'm a broadcast journalist. My forte is radio, and I've been dabbling in some television, but my comfort zone is radio. But I've been able to play around with my words and get a little creative. And I think that is one of the takeaways from this fellowship with Climate Tracker. It has now put me in a better position to know how to write, with the guidance of our mentors, how to structure things, how to make things clearer, and to make it as easy as possible for the ordinary man to understand. So I just want to say I'm grateful for this opportunity that Climate Tracker has afforded me. And I do hope that many other journalists across the region would use this opportunity. It doesn't matter if you have a year experience, 2 years experience, 10 years experience. If you're given that opportunity to take up a fellowship on climate-related issues, it is going to help you well beyond the few months that you engage with Climate Tracker. It's going to help you to propel your career in a whole new direction and to see things differently, and how important it is and how responsible you should be in bringing these issues to the forefront in your own territory.
Well, folks, that wraps up this episode of Caribbean Climate Calabash. A big, big, big thank you to Colvin for sharing his on-the-ground perspective from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. As we continue to face the reality of climate change and increasingly powerful storms, the stories that we tell and the lessons that we learn will be crucial to building resilience in the Caribbean. This podcast is brought to you by Climate Tracker Caribbean, and we're committed to bringing you the stories that matter most to our islands. So be sure to subscribe and follow us for more conversations on climate issues across the Caribbean. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends and your community. I'm Dizzanne Billy, and until next time, let's keep the climate conversation going.